I would be out doing the fun experiences. I don't know many jobs where I've skydived, I've hang glided, I have bungee jumped, I have seen the Northern Lights at the Arctic Circle in a 737, all for a day at work. And I'm talking CEOs, CFOs, CIOs are still the ones that are in their gym at 5 a.m. and doing the work because they get it, they believe in it, they know the mental health capacity, but generally there's a why behind that.
Welcome back to the Canadian Dream Podcast. Today we have a specialist in communication and in fitness. You might have seen her on television or on a cruise ship, on the TV, on the cruise ship, or you might have seen her or watched her episodes on the All Things Fitness and Wellness podcast. I'm here with Krissy Vann. Hi, Krissy.
Hello, Elton. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for coming by. So, did I say it right? All Things Fitness and Wellness
yes,
podcast?
You nailed it. You nailed it.
Yeah. So the acronym is ATFYFW podcast.
Yes.
So you host this podcast, but you have so much experience in television, radio, and what else?
Oh, goodness. I'm like television, radio, producing, editing. I've really had to wear a lot of hats throughout my career, and I do find the podcasting medium allows you to put all of those together and have a lot of creativity along the ride as well.
So give me some more details about your career. So how many years were you working on TV? What did you do? And then when did you switch to radio or from radio and producing?
Yeah, honestly, it started since I was a little kid. I was the child, and granted, it was that honker of a VHS. I would carry it around and I would interview my family. I'm not even kidding. Or when you listen to the radio, everyone would make mixtapes. I'm obviously a child of the 90s. Play and record, but instead of the average mixtape, I had this little plug-in microphone and I would DJ in between the songs. So the seed was planted, and I actually, even when I was a little kid, very into dramatics. Public speaking competitions were my jam. Terrible at sports. Public speaking was where my specialty was. And then it was about high school. You know, when you would do a project, they would have these case studies. And in one of the case studies, the girl that was depicted in it was a journalist. And that's when the spark sort of twisted in my brain that, oh, there could be a career path that I could go here, and that big aha moment. So I was kind of lucky because I knew what I wanted to do since I was a little kid. It took shape. I went to school for broadcasting, radio, television, and film, and it was time to do an internship. And they were like, you can go anywhere. And I'm like, do you really mean you could go anywhere? Has anyone ever gone abroad? So I actually interned in Christchurch, New Zealand at Canterbury Television. And it was one of the best decisions that I ever made because it was a very small station. They'd never had a random Canadian show up at their door. So they threw me into the fire. And before you knew it, I was behind the scenes doing big studio camera. And by the end of the internship, they actually let me do reporting in the field. Granted, adult braces, green as can be. But I came back home with this like confidence for some reason that was like, I've made it and I'm going to make it. Needless to say, sent out resumes constantly. That's when you realize you don't quite have the experience yet. And I really wanted to travel. So I found out about a job called Port and Shopping Guide on cruise ships. And that's how that ended up happening. So I would travel 6 months out of the year. I would do these shopping talks for about 1,000 guests a cruise. You had a TV show internally. And it was a wild experience. I will say, if you've ever cruised, what happens below deck, very different than what happens above deck. Yeah. It's a whole different world. But came back once again thinking, how do I get my break? And that's where local radio is where I started. And I was more on the promotion side, but again, really wanted to be on air. So they finally gave me a weekend show. I remember the first show, I was quite literally screaming in the microphone. I get a call from the production manager being like, hey, just speak normally, please, because I've given you that opportunity, but you're so nervous. Did that for a little while, and then it would have been when I was 25. I had wanted to work at the Weather Network so badly, which sounds funny now because we have weather apps, But at the time, you genuinely would tune into a television station to think, is my drive going to be terrible or not? Am I going to get snowed on or not? It was a big fabric and a 24-hour channel people tuned into. So I applied every 4 months consistently, declined, ghosted, didn't hear anything, kept trying. I was adamant because I never wanted to do hard news. I knew that about myself. I was way too bubbly to be that serious 100% of my career. So eventually, I think they just were like, this girl's not going to stop. Let's just get her in here for an interview. I show up to the interview, no idea that they were starting a traffic app. So you have to keep in mind, at the time I lived in a little town in Niagara-on-the-Lake, used the MapQuest GPS to get there. And in the middle of the interview, they go, okay, stand up and give us a traffic report.
Ooh.
Yeah. Immediately, I'm like, I have no idea how I even got here. I don't know any of the roads in this big city. And they can see the panic. And I'm like, I just decided, be honest in that moment. And instead, they were like, well, you lived in New Zealand. Can you give us a 1-minute monologue on your time in New Zealand? Okay, perfect. Except the nerves were so in me. I remember I got in my car, bawled the whole way home. I was like,
You thought you had screwed it.
This job. Oh, yeah. I was convinced that completely went off the rails. But apparently they were suckers for punishment. And that was how I got in and had an incredible career with them and made a few leaps in between. And overall, I did live national or major network television for over 10 years.
Wow. For which broadcasters?
So I was with Palmer Expedia, which is the Weather Network. And then through them, I was with CBC News Network. So basically, a lot of times in the newsroom, you would have your IFB pack, which is what we use to hear the studios. Mm-hmm. And I would have Weather Network studio in my ear in the green screen room. And then I'd have to click over and switch and do cut-ins for CBC News Network. I felt deeply honored and cool when Peter Mansbridge said my name. And then from there, that's how I was able to move to Vancouver. So I had heard rumor that there would be changes. And you have to keep in mind, I graduated in 2008, which was the recession. So we were just starting to get into the beginning of these news organizations doing a lot of consolidation. And one of the rumors that had happened was that we were going to be getting rid of reporter-camera combos and making that one job. So when I was still in Ontario, I started to shadow our camera operators, the big, gigantic ones, a huge box we'd lug around called a DeGero at the time to go live. And I used my own time to learn that. And I'm very grateful that there were camera operators that were willing to let me skill up. So eventually they did, unfortunately, do layoffs across the country of those combos, posted them up as video journalist jobs, and that's how I landed in Vancouver. I remember showing up to my first media scrum, and it's all these seasoned broadcasters and camera operators and CBC here and CTV here, and you're just thinking imposter syndrome, just act natural like you know what you're doing. I did, but you have those questionings of yourself in that moment. And then I stayed in that career after moving to Vancouver for, I think it was another 5 years. And then the opportunity at CTV Morning Live Vancouver opened up. And at that point, now remote work's so common, but when I was a video journalist, you're just a party of one. And I realized I wanted a stronger sense of community and that morning show experience. I think when I saw the ideal of working in TV, I wanted to know what that was like. And so that was kind of my final foray in that medium.
Wow. And well, I have so many questions here, but radio, where does radio come in?
So radio would have been my early 20s. So basically...
Oh, and just to clarify, so until you moved to Vancouver, where were you based?
So I was in St. Catharines, Ontario, and I was a commuter. So when I worked at Weather Network, I commuted 168 kilometers round trip a day. 84 there, 84 back.
So from St. Catharines to...
Oakville.
To Oakville.
Just outside of Toronto, for those not familiar.
Okay. Yeah, so I was gonna explain that St. Catharines is just around Toronto. Okay. Yeah, so I was just going to explain that St. Catharines is actually about 100 kilometers from Toronto in Ontario. Yeah, okay. Was your family, your parents, were they also Canadian? Were they born in Canada?
Yeah, so my dad would have been first generation here, so their family was from Belgium. And my mom's...
Because you have a Dutch or...
Van Nieuwenhove is the full kit and caboodle. All 14 letters. Trust me, my little pony lunchbox as a kid, the label maker just wrapped around. That's how long the last one was. But so born and raised Canadian. And then it was them. We grew up in Toronto, and then they made the leap to Niagara.
So before we talk more about radio and television, going back, where do you think that your appetite for being in the spotlight and for speaking, for communication start or come from?
It's honestly wild because I never remember a time not having that within me, but it was nice because I had a family that nurtured it.
What did your parents do?
So my dad was a chiropractor, and my mom helped him out with his business so my dad passed away when I was 17. He was ill my whole life, which will loop into the fitness side of why that became important to me eventually. But my mom, actually, kudos to her, she went back to school at the age of 40 to become a registered nurse and managed to support our family.
Wow. And you have siblings?
I have one sister.
Okay. So you don't know where you started being interested in showing up in front of a camera and holding a microphone? You don't know where that came from?
I was the kid that was the ham 100% of the time. School plays, I was in it. I used to I remember begging my teacher, and it would have been grade 1. I coordinated this group at recess when the weather was bad. Instead of going out, I would make these plays, and then we would set a day and put them on. So I just had this incredible creative energy that I think I recognized for some reason and was just so attuned with from a young age. And I think my parents recognized that in me and just allowed places for that to play and to flourish. I still feel that inside of me. It's like this, sometimes you almost wish that insatiable urge would stop because I would relax more, but I just endlessly wanted to create. And when it comes to performance, so to speak, it's a way to connect with other people. And I also have a lot of curiosity about other people. I am a big extrovert, so I enjoy being around other people. So as much as I may not understand exactly where the spark, because it happened so young, started to flicker, I do innately understand for some reason it's just threaded and part of me.
It fits with your personality.
Yes.
So let's talk about television. It seems for an outsider that it's a very, very competitive world. Well, now it is, unfortunately or fortunately, it's dying off. So let alone today, but say when television was at its peak, let's say 10, 20 years ago, everybody dreamed of working for a broadcaster. Everybody who studied communications or journalism, for example. But it seems to be so hard to get your foot inside the door. How competitive was it for you once you were already inside?
It still was. To be honest, so much of my story, and it's the parts that people never share, I was rejected a lot. I got very good at moving through rejection, thank goodness. Even that traffic job that somehow I scored, even though I never knew where I was going half of the time, that basically was an app branch that they had created off of the Weather Network at the time. And it was a concept that went up and went down in about a year and a half. So I was laid off 2 years into my career from my full-time job. And when you're in your early 20s, you think the world has just fallen apart. Luckily, because they were Weather Network, I was still able to get a casual job with them at the time and move up from there. But internally, there were things that I applied to that I did not get. Even when I moved out here, a good example of this was breakfast television at the time, which in its, it doesn't really exist in that fashion out here now, but they were hiring for a morning host. And this is when I was starting to realize I wanted to be in a more newsroom environment. And I believe I had about 5 interviews with them. I had made it far into the process, and it was a long interview process. And at this point, you're dreaming of the job coming to life. I saw myself in that seat. Then you get the call. It's not you.
Oh, after 5 rounds of interviews, oh gosh.
Right? Yeah. But at that point, there had been so many different things that I had applied to and had that rejection. I kind of had this philosophy, all right, you get 2 days to feel upset about it, and then we're going to pick ourselves up and move forward. Ultimately, what ended up happening is a couple years down the line, they shut down that show. So truthfully, if
Oh,
that
wow.
dream had come into play,
yeah.
I would have had heartache down the line, which is interesting. But to your point, I always would try to explain to people because, again, graduated in a recession. So already companies were starting that consolidation, that contraction. And as a result of that, that competitive industry from 20 years ago was now even more so competitive because they were way less jobs with way more hats.
Yeah.
And sometimes, if you're me, I'd never wanted to be a hard news journalist in the field. And I also never wanted to be an anchor on the desk. I have tremendous respect for those roles. However, my personality didn't align. So now I've already shrunken my possibilities by a pretty large degree if you're wanting to work in traditional media. And so sometimes a job might come up once or twice a year that there would
For
be
you to apply
correct.
together with other 200 applicants
Exactly.
from all over the country
And
or
sometimes
North
even
America.
beyond.
Yeah.
Right? And then
Wow.
it's like the industry's so small. So they might have a beat that they know some accomplished broadcasters making an exit at a competitor and they could scoop them.
Yeah.
So you might apply, but never really
And,
had a
and usually
chance.
they already have a few top applicants that they want
Yes.
for that job.
So competition was always part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I never let it deter me though. In my mind,
That's awesome.
I don't know why. I think it was because I was the kid that was just like, I don't know how I'm going to get there, but we're just going to keep going. I've actually journaled through my whole career, and I'm grateful because every one of those rejections and how painful they were at the time are documented.
Oh, okay. So when is that book coming out?
It's funny. Writing is something I deeply enjoy.
And you haven't published it yet?
I feel like something's genuinely taking shape.
Okay.
Not even I feel. I know.
What
something's
would be
taking
the title for that book if you were to publish it
Oh,
today?
goodness. To be honest, it's going to end up weaving somewhere into motorcycles at the same time because they play a big role. So
Okay, yeah, we'll talk about your passion for motorcycles in just a bit. Okay, back to television. So you also hosted a morning show for CTV Vancouver, right? Tell me about that experience.
it was a really unique one. I lucked out. So they essentially were starting a new element of the morning show. And it would be the first time in the newswheel that they ever sold time within the news show. So it was branded, sponsored content. Editorially, you need to make it interesting for the viewers. There needs to be value for the viewers without them feeling like they've tuned into a shopping network. And then at the same time, you need to make sure your clients are happy and that their message is something that was delivered. So it was a really unique experience because I was at the forefront of that. So I did weather for them as well. It started out as weekend weather and 3 days a week community host, it was called. Days that weren't sold, I would be out doing the fun experiences. I don't know many jobs where I've skydived, I've hang glided, I have bungee jumped, I have seen the Northern Lights at the Arctic Circle in a 737, all for a day at work. Like, it was a very uncommon office to have. But at the same time, the primary role was really working with these clients and getting their message out. So grateful to have that experience because it ended up expanding so much so that it became Monday to Friday. I would still help out on weather. That was my bread and butter. I'm a huge weather nerd, so I never minded jumping into that hot seat. But for me to have that experience of working with client relations, I think it actually helped prepare me so much for making leaps beyond that. And it's just fun to get a concept sometimes that was a little bit dry. Let's face it, sometimes what's sold, you're like, cool, we're talking about concrete today. How do we make concrete sound exciting at 7 a.m.? And somehow we would manage to do it. And it was nice because I did have a camera ops / producer team. We would produce the segments together. So once it was sold, it was our little baby. And we got to craft things the way we wanted. And I learned so much in that experience. And plus, doing live TV in the morning, nothing better. Nothing better.
Really? With your... okay.
I don't mind an early alarm clock.
You
It's
don't?
the energy of the live, because there's something in realizing that the same time you're looking into that camera, you once again are connecting with people.
Yeah.
I didn't get to see the people, but I knew they were on the other side.
Right. What were the most important lessons that you learned during those, what was it, close to a decade working in television?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think knowing how to take criticism. We often hear that criticism, we hear it and we're like, criticism. No, we automatically assume as human beings that it's something to be feared, to feel ashamed of. Whatever emotions come up generally aren't positive when we hear criticism. I think it's one of the most valuable skill sets I got very early. I remember being in broadcasting school, and let's face it, what you're doing is rough. You think you've got it figured out because you're 20. You don't. The stuff is terrible. Thank God. That's how we learn. But what we would do is shoot our things, and then we would sit all as a class, and it would go up on the big projector. And as a class, you would have to sit while everyone critiqued your work. And sometimes it would feel harsh because when you're doing on camera, and you know this as well as a creator, it to a degree feels personal because it is. Yeah. It's your image, it's how you sound, it's how you look, it's how you spoke, what you ask, what it looked like, all of it. But if you are able to actually take constructive criticism and apply it and upskill your skill set,
and you just get better.
You just get better. And it also gives you a hunger for it in a way. So then as you're either changing careers or going into a new role, you're less afraid to ask the questions. I think that would be my second thing. The biggest lesson I learned, ask the questions. Do not sit there ever and say, oh, I'm too nervous to look stupid or dumb if I ask this. Or how many times does our mental thought say, I should know this, but I actually don't. And maybe I'm just going to try and fudge it.
In what context do you mean asking questions?
I think anytime you're just in a situation, especially from a work perspective, where you don't necessarily know if you're doing it right.
Okay.
You know, or
so in general in life.
Yeah, or like, you
don't know
when
something,
I was learning how to be a video journalist. And I remember being out there for those first few scrums as I spoke, thinking, oh my goodness, I have no business being here next to these industry veterans that are so incredible. There were times where I would have issues with a cable or things like this. I would have no shame going up to one of the competitors that are out there and say, hey, have you encountered this? Do you happen to know a way to work around this? Yeah. Guess what? 9 times out of 10, I left that with another skill I didn't have before. Or if I ended up with the same issue, I actually knew how to fix it myself. And I think sometimes we get disillusioned that people just have it all figured out. And as a result, we put that pressure on ourselves. Don't do that. It's okay to not know everything.
Yeah.
Don't ever try to pretend that you do. And then the third one would say, don't get stuck. If you get rejected or get a layoff or things don't go the way you plan, anytime we audit in life, if you do audits of yourself, the things that don't work out, and I know it sounds so cliche, generally are putting us on a trajectory. It's a redirection. Every time I'm like, it's a redirection. And it always has been, but you have to participate in that. You have to participate in that. Because if you decide to just, oh, the world handed me this card and it owes you something, no, you're going to be waiting a long time. You are the one that has to get up and go get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so move on, but still keep moving, right?
Yes, feel it for sure, but...
So, Krissy, give me a few examples of things that you learned, practical examples, like, oh, this is how you position your hands when you're standing, or this is what you do if you have a microphone, this is what you should not do, or when you're talking, don't talk at the same time as the person. Do you remember? Let's go 3, 4, 5 short examples of things you learned.
Green screen was a big one. That's
for the weather. It's always a green screen, right?
Yes.
So people who are watching have no idea that everything they're pointing at, it's a green screen. How do you know where you're pointing?
You have these screens on either side. So I actually can see what's on my screen. And then you generally would just cheat your head just enough. So I'm still looking at you and it looks like I'm looking over there, but I'm actually looking at my screen to make sure that I'm in the right position. They're angled almost just right, but that's a big one. Ad lib. I would just pick a topic sometimes. I dare you to give me almost anything and I could probably make up a monologue for it. Having the ability to speak without having things overly prepared is a tremendous skill set to hone. Always honing it. And on that note, getting rid of filler words. I still do this even as a podcaster because new filler words creep up. You probably know this even from yourself, and then you hear them and go, like mine for so long was absolutely. And then every time I'd hear absolutely, you're like, oh no. But the minute you catch it, then I almost would give myself a tap I've done that again. And then, to kind of cue your brain. So that would be another one. And then more so, a lot of them were on the technical side because I had to build my own graphics when I did weather. We did our own producing for our segments in the morning show. So we used a program called iNews at the time. So figuring out where everything goes in the lineup. And if you mess up something in that spreadsheet, you quite possibly have hooped something very large in your director's show. You will hear about it.
And can you think of any big screw-ups that you had?
Oh my gosh. I definitely more so on that side. Like I've accidentally deleted a story out of a lineup. Yeah, not great. Not
Before
great.
it went live?
Correct. But
then?
like when it's not caught and then you're hearing in your IFB when you're out in the field, where's the da-da-da? And you're trying to scramble and figure it out while you're out there. So things like that are big ones because in television news, it's live, it's happening. So either it's making it into the show or it's not. And I also, this is not a thing that happened often, but definitely happened, is I had set up a shoot that was live in the morning, and sometimes we would have pre-recorded content, sometimes we wouldn't. Regardless, we had opted and switched things around, and I forgot that I'd set up the shoot. So I got a call from somebody that you can imagine they've gotten up way too early. They're now waiting for me and I'm not there. They probably told their friends and family they're going to be on TV that day. That's a heart-sinking moment. Mm-hmm. That's when you take responsibility immediately. Don't give them an excuse, a rhyme, or reason. That's when you apologize for somebody's time.
Mm-hmm. And so walk me through that process of the moment you decided, I have had enough of this. Did you see anything coming your way? Was anything happening with television itself, or was it any external force that brought you to podcasting?
So this is a little bit where motorcycles come in.
Motorcycles?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is going to seem like a funny term, but it'll circle around. So I was 32 when I decided to start riding again. And all of a sudden I was exposed to this group of women that were living so authentically themselves. It was impossible to ignore, and started to tug on something in me that didn't quite feel aligned with where I was, which was a funny feeling because I had dreamed of being exactly where I was, and I worked really hard for the career that I had, and I got through all of the rejection, and all of a sudden it was like this really cozy sweater you've washed a million times, but it shrunk. It didn't fit anymore. And my brain had a hard time rectifying that because you're just like, but you've worked for this and it's supposed to be your dream. The environment after going through the pandemic, I will say, had an impact on me for sure. I always had this theory that sometimes the newsroom environment would be a little bit of negative energy. And I think I'm a big believer in what our mental diet is. What you read, what you listen to, I think impacts how we feel. And it makes a lot of sense to me that news generally is not good news. And so if you're ingesting that every day, you're probably going to feel that. And through that time period, it was constantly ingesting this bad, scary news, no matter what your beliefs politically are on the subject. Mm-hmm. Add to that, you had a very polarized society. So I was having to walk through protesters to go to work. These same people that would message you on social media hoping that you die because that's what you do for a living, or yelling at you and saying you're a paid actor. If I was, I'd love to see the paycheck. But that started to get very wearing. And I just knew with traditional media shrinking and that creative energy ball that I talked about since I was a little kid, that wasn't getting fed as much anymore. And the thing when you work for corporate, generally your avenues for expanding beyond their walls are much more limited. Contractually, they own basically anything that you do. Mm-hmm. And so I knew if I wanted to break through that, I probably couldn't do it with them. So I sat with that feeling for about a year and a half, and I just stayed open. In my mind, I stopped resisting the feeling, and I was like, I'm just going to see what resonates with me and if something enters my sphere. And ultimately something did that lit me up. And I was like, okay, we jumped out of a plane. We've done the things. Let's just take a really big leap.
So what happened specifically?
So it was interesting. So my business partner, who I have now, actually used to be one of my clients in my branded sponsored content role. So I showed up to a shoot one day in a gym, which I am a huge gym lover. So these were always really fun shoots, and they had been a client for some time. And it was like, oh, the big guy wants to see ya. And my business partner's 6'5", so legitimately the big guy. And in my head, I was like, oh, we're going to have some sort of editorial conflict, because sometimes they would want to promote certain things, but in news, you still have to keep in mind of church and state. So there would be certain elements where we're like, we can't cover it that way. And sometimes it's harder to have a client understand that. So I'm prepared for that to be the conversation. And instead, I was presented with an idea that didn't exist in any capacity, but it was like, there is this idea that I'd like to bring to reality, and I want you to do it. How do I get you here? He thinks he had the best negotiating of his life. He has no idea. He does now. I tell him, we go back and forth, because he's like, haha, I got you. I'm like, you caught me at the right time, the right thing. So essentially, the idea was a business to business fitness industry media brand. Obviously, the podcast is kind of our main component of that as we've been building it out. And for me, as soon as it was in the fitness avenue, that was something I really wanted to get behind, because as an industry, they're really addressing the physical inactivity crisis. There's a lot of government lobbying that's taken place, because truthfully, the statistics are terrifying. And what that goes back to, my dad was a type 1 diabetic. That's an autoimmune disease. There's nothing that you can do. He had it since he was 2. But through that, he was I'll put it this way. I grew up in a Catholic family. I don't practice the religion now, but we were Catholic. There is a sacrament that's called the last rites. It's what people do before they pass away. It's supposed to absolve you of your sins, etc. He had it 21 times. That's 21 goodbyes. It was a rocky ride.
So 21 times he thought he was about to die.
Yes. Wow. Life support, all of it. Heart attack, stroke. If you look at what could happen to a diabetic, unfortunately, he was the poster person for it. When you look at the physical inactivity crisis, movement, when it comes to preventing chronic disease, is one of the number one things that we can do. Yeah. And so type 2 diabetes is way up there, preventable. Heart disease, all of these things. And so to me, I was like, if I could get my voice behind something that would make people healthier and feel better, I'm 100% aligned with that. And truthfully, from a mental health perspective as well, the gym for me was my solace. Through all those early infancies of my career, my dad passed when I was 17. We were very, very close. And so the gym became my space to kind of process grief. And so to me, just the power of that space, I was like, game on, let's do this. Let's create something out of nothing.
Okay, so let me put the pieces together here. So one, the motorcycle group was your therapy group. And those ladies and that lifestyle just helped you figure out that you were no longer fulfilled working in television. And then this guy who was a client had a proposal, hey, let's start this podcast and this business for the fitness industry. And your father, having had those health issues, incentivized or kind of encouraged you to have a more active lifestyle. So you were already into bodybuilding. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Because that's the piece that is missing here. Did you win any competitions as a bodybuilder?
In Prince George, which I don't know if that's the wildest accolade.
So tell me about your experience in the gym.
Yeah. Honestly, I realized I just loved lifting weights. Loved it. I still do love lifting weights. Headphones in, it's just the best feeling. And it's great to see more and more. I mean, Gen Z is killing it. They're all in the space. They're understanding what it's utilized for. But for myself, I said, I was a kid. I was terrible at sports. Collected participation ribbons like a champ. Warmed a lot of benches. As I got older, I realized the gym, there's no competition in that set. It's me against me in that space. But because I have that little competitive streak within me, that's when bodybuilding competitions became appealing to me. And I think for myself, it would have been 2016, I believe I did my first one. And so looking for my sense of community as well. I was still at the Weather Network at the time, so working remotely by myself. And like anything, there's communities.
And you were living in Prince George?
No. I was living in Vancouver. I drove all the way to Prince George to do that
For the competition. To take that crown.
Yeah, exactly. To take that little plastic trophy that is not in my house. 'Cause what are you going to do with that?
So where do you work out in Vancouver? At Fitness World?
Yeah.
Oh, you do? Yeah. I am a customer too. My wife and I, we also work out at Fitness World.
Yeah.
Which is your favorite gym? The favorite
Well,
location?
for me, proximity is very important. So Canby would be the closest.
Yeah.
I always think path of least of
So you go to
resistance.
Canby and 12th?
And then admittedly,
Canby and 12th?
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I go most of the time.
so I'm very lucky as well. Where my podcast studio is actually head office for there as well, even though 2 separate companies. But there's tons of gym equipment. So I basically am a kid in a candy store every time I go there.
I also like the Kitsilano location.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and downtown. I went to the downtown location many times. But I think it was before the new management came in.
Right. It probably was on Granville at the time.
Yeah.
And now it's up on West Georgia. Fun fact, I walked into the glass door at West Georgia. It was very embarrassing. Put my whole face print on it.
Oh, boom.
Yeah.
You can't
Dignity
see
got
it.
left behind in there.
That's
So
how-
let me know if you find
That's
it.
how clean it is.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
clean the
It's like,
door
good
so
job,
well, I
guys.
think it's wide open. Okay, so then you found yourself. It sounds like you found yourself. Right partner, great people, talking about fitness, and you are also business oriented, aren't you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I quit my job, which was a really big deal for me. Like monumental decision. I'm very passionate,
I can
connected
imagine.
to my work.
You're giving up on what is a dream for many, 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 many people.
And you know that there's somebody in the waiting wings immediately, right?
There's probably 30 people waiting in the line.
So I make that exit. I feel so good about it on a high. And then I start this new venture. And that's when all of a sudden you go, oh my goodness, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't even tell you how many baths I took that winter just to tamper down the anxiety and the imposter syndrome that bubbled within me.
Before starting the podcast?
Yes.
Really?
Because I'd never tackled something like that. And not that I didn't have belief in myself, but I think it was interesting to have somebody that believed in me so much. So there was that, what did they see in me? Am I going to deliver? And there's that perfectionist element as well that I've really had to work on because I think it's something that can serve you but also be your detriment. But I was very anxious at first. Also, I was learning the back end of an entire industry. I had known fitness from a consumer side, but I was learning the business side. And I do feel like I came to the table with some business savvy, but I also stepped into that arena realizing there was a whole world of business I didn't know, nor did I have all the answers or the skill sets. And that's where I say ask the questions, because for one of the first times in my career, I also had a mentor that knew all of this about me. And even though I didn't quite understand it at first, because I'd never had that dynamic, it was the corporate dynamic. Here's the formula, here's what you follow, and you're going to have your performance review to fit in these 4 boxes, and off you go. Whereas now it was like, take your skills, play, throw things at the wall. How incredible is that? But at the same time, it's disconcerting. It was scary. It was scary.
So tell me, I wrote it down here. I actually copied, pasted what the podcast is about. Things, Fitness, and Wellness is a podcast on a mission for everyone to live a life fit and well. Tell me more about it. So what was the vision for the podcast, and how did it play out for you?
Yeah, the vision really evolved over time until we really niched it down. Because at first, as I say, I was just kind of researching this industry. And essentially what happened, I went to my first industry trade show, the March. So I had quit my job in August, kind of got balls rolling in September, built a studio by hand, by the way. I gorilla glued my own hair together, not on purpose. If it ever happens to you, olive oil, that's the trick. Put that all together. And then I went to my first industry trade show. And that's when I was like, oh, I get it now. I see it now. So the mission really became about amplifying our focus as on C-suite executives and people in those higher levels of the industry and getting them all on the same page and together. So it's knowledge sharing for them. I also really, and I know we were talking about this before we started today, I do have curiosity over people. One of the things I love about this industry so much, I don't think I've yet to have somebody on that doesn't practice what they preach. And I'm talking CEOs, CFOs, CIOs are still the ones that are in their gym at 5 a.m. and doing the work because they get it, they believe in it, they know the mental health capacity. But generally, there's a why behind that mindset. And that's the piece that I like to pull out of them as well.
What's the why? Tell me.
Well, it's always different, right? And generally there's a story behind it and drawing that out of people. And so really from an industry side, it's happening in Canada, the States, I know the UK as well, but there's a lot of upper level legislation that they're trying to get through. For example, in Canada, we have a tax line that they're working to get through so people would be able to write off gym memberships or health club memberships, incentivize people to get more people moving. The states are doing this as well. So I quit my job in August, rough out the podcast, go to my first industry event, and then somehow that may end up reporting in the halls of Capitol Hill with the top 75 executives in the fitness industry who were going into Congress and Senate to help propel their message of passing the FIT Act in the United States. Trust me, when I got there, I was like, whew, how did this happen? But tenacity, I guess.
So the goal was to connect all these business owners?
Yes. So really just
So you're creating a community for businesses in fitness and health industries?
Which really they intersect. So a lot of what's happening in the fitness industry side, is they're really pivoting into this preventative healthcare niche. So that's more so... If you probably will notice it now that I say it in advertising in the space, if you think of how gyms or health clubs advertise, you're very rarely going to hear messaging that's around shredded abs, or as a woman that grew up in the era of diet culture, it's no longer about lose weight or get rid of that summer body and all of those negative non-motivating languages that we used before. They're really pivoting to more so help people understand social health, physical health, mental health. They're all part of the package.
Yeah, living better, longer.
Yeah, longevity.
We made a documentary from scratch, self-funded. I think I did it like 6 or 7 years ago, with people in their 70s and 80s who are super fit. Here from Vancouver and Whistler and Burnaby, so from the Vancouver area and Whistler. And we actually interviewed a few people, the film features a few people. One of them was 83, and he's still doing this now. He's 90 or 91 now. He is a ski instructor.
Amazing.
In Whistler. One of them, she just turned 90, I think last month. She once held the world record in a marathon run at her age group, 70 something. So she was in her 80s running marathons here from British Columbia. And so what I wanted to say is that, by the way, if you want to watch it, thefitgeneration.ca.
I want to watch it.
Yeah, it's free on YouTube. It's on YouTube, The Fit Generation documentary, Vancouver, you will find it. But what I wanted to say is that being a newcomer, myself, 13, 14 years ago, it was very different. The fact that so many older people here are way more careful, and they take better care of themselves than in most poor countries around the world. But for you know the industry better. How much room do we have for improvement?
Massive. I mean, truthfully, Vancouver, I feel we do a very good job.
Better than in other provinces, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I believe, I'd have to fact check this, but St. Catharines, where I was from, at one point had the highest obesity rates per capita in Canada. That was a title a long time ago. We also had the most Tim Hortons, might be a correlation, no judgment. But when it comes to being physically active, it's like 80% of Canadians aren't meeting the minimums. When we look at the youth from a North American perspective, the lack of movement and sedentary behavior is just so devastating to watch, honestly. At the end of the day, our loneliness epidemic as well, when you look at it, you would think that it doesn't correlate, but it was the Surgeon General last May that declared it an epidemic of loneliness. And you're like, movement, when we look at it from a whole, whether it's in a gym or meeting in the park or things like that, it connects people. We have a mental health crisis on our hands. I have interviewed Dr. Ben Singh. He's the University of South Australia. I think it was last March, his study came out that was talking about how exercise is scientifically proven to be more effective than antidepressants. Now, don't get me wrong, depending on what your mental health situation is, absolutely go the medical route. But these are basics that we should have in place, and sadly, we don't. We don't at all. And I'm just kind of like, where is the disconnect? And there's just more and more things in our lives to distract us. Our phones, my phone's sitting right here. Binge watching, how many times have people sat and the TV asked them, hey, are you still there watching? Because you watched episode after episode. Society has kind of gotten complacent, unfortunately. And so we're not really seeing numbers improve.
And also, I think people want to have, and you're in that side on that side of the court. People are not having kids anymore. People are not having families anymore, like at least not big families anymore. And also, what has become so common is just you swipe people left in your life, you just block people, you ghost people. Ghosting has become so much more common lately. And I think people become more and more isolated. And one of the takeaways from our film, going back to the Fit Generation, is for many of those seniors, they are living a better life, not only because they are exercising and staying fit, but because many times those groups that they exercise with become their support groups.
Yes. My mom is a good example of that.
A huge thing.
She was widowed and sadly had her own depression for quite a long time. Moved to Halifax, didn't know anybody post-COVID, and started pickleball. And for the first time in many years, my mom's social life is so robust. I go down there, we're running into Rose on the corner and this one. And it was from making one decision to get out there and try something new. And that's the part that makes me believe in it so much. And again, sadly, our statistics in Canada, not only it's the majority of the populace aren't getting the minimum amounts of physical activity, it also costs our healthcare system billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Billions with a B.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, and when we look, unfortunately, I mean, I don't need to get in a political discussion, but our healthcare system has been very strained. Anybody that's needed care recently, the waits certainly aren't the same as what I experienced 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
There are ways we could alleviate the system, and it's pretty simple. It's getting more
preventiveness.
Yes. And so, as I say, for me, being on the industry side, it's about unifying people. Really, we're all getting unified under this message. And obviously, from a podcast side, for people within the industry, it provides learnings from each other of where the industry is at. You know, in podcasting as well, when you're able to do virtual, when Europe was having their energy crisis, well, I'm able to pull somebody up from there and have them on and learn about how that's impacting them.
Is your podcast global? What's the scope?
Yeah,
Yes.
so primarily North American, but for sure I've had global guests on, and I started doing this thing, Exercise Snacks, Bite-Size Science, because I would see all this incredible research coming out, and sometimes they get picked up and all of a sudden every news organization's covering them. But I'm like, oh, where's this researcher? Let's talk. So.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, for us, it's the Canadian Dream podcast. It's more a niche. We have to find great people that are in Canada.
Look, you're spoiled for choice.
Yeah. And you always talk to people who are in the C-suite category. So basically the chief, CEOs, CFOs, etc. So the high executives, right? Mostly business owners or partners, etc. What lessons have you learned from these guys? Because we're talking about winners, relentless people.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting because I actually reflect on this quite a bit, because you're always like, how can I learn something myself and apply it to my own life? And so often their advice is the simplest to say, but often the hardest for us to put in action. It's those when it doesn't work, understanding that you don't need to be married to an idea that's not working and pivot. I think that's a big one when they're like, oh, we really thought that we were going to try. And instead of doubling down and keep going in a direction that's not working, not being afraid to actually shift gears, that's a big one that I see come up. Adaptability is hand in hand with that. And I think you're speaking with a lot of business owners now that went through exceptionally trying times over the last couple of years. So if they've survived on the other side of that, it's understanding diversification, not being afraid of technology is a big one now. You know, obviously everyone's hearing AI spoken about over and over again. I mean, we joked about it earlier when it comes to writers and what an impact that has had. But staying attuned and not afraid of what's coming up because it's coming anyways. So how do you work with it? And when it comes to them actually making things happen from nothing, it's the self-belief. Every single one of them has this self-belief. And a lot of their businesses, when you look at them now, you're like, man, how'd you get investors? That must have sounded like a wild idea. And then they'll tell you about all the no's that they got. And they just kept going till they got those few yeses to take a bite. I think that self-belief, if you don't have that with your idea and within yourself, that's ultimately going to be where a dream is going to get crushed. And more than likely, you're the culprit that crushed it.
Yeah, wow, I love all this. I'm all about all these things too. And out of curiosity, how many of those people wake up late? Because, you know, this is something that I've been telling. I changed this in my life when I started listening to some podcasts, and I found, you know, it was a common theme. Every successful people seems to say that waking up early is one of the key components of your life. But there's still people that are resistant to this idea. Does anybody wake up late?
It's funny that now that you say this, I was like, oh, I should ask them this question on my podcast. What time do you get up today? I can tell you this. Anytime I've gone to industry events, I'm an early riser. Always have been, with my coffee, I will say. And I remember I always normally go to the gym because you're going to have this big, busy work day. So I'm like, I'll hit the hotel gym, top of the morning, have it to myself. Usually do. Not if you're at a fitness industry event. Packed every single time. So I would argue they're rising and shining for sure.
Yeah. So tell me more about motorcycling now.
Yeah.
How often do you do that? What do you drive or what do you ride?
So I have a Ducati Scrambler.
And you have a tattoo as well?
I do. So
what is that tattoo about?
Crankle.
Crankle.
So this is a group of women that I ride with, but it's our emergency word. So if anything's ever going rough in life, you crankle, they will come. And they really do, honestly. To me...
So, sorry, it is a support group.
Yes.
Like you guys, is it a club? How do you join?
No,
do you have to be invited? Is there a secret password?
This is the nice thing. It's one of the most open communities that I have ever encountered. So quick backstory. I learned to ride when I was 21. My friend's dad owned a motorcycle dealership. We were like, yeah, why not? Started on scooters and I had a little CBR 125. I was terrified. The wind blew and I was like, surely this is how I die. And I was an adrenaline junkie, but I was like, not ready for that. So I gave it up. Fast forward, I was 32. I was on the back of a motorcycle, women's riding down, Abbotsford, golden hour. She just looked majestic. And I thought to myself, why the heck am I back here? So I wrote my test the next day and I bought the bike the following. I had a Honda Rebel at the time that I learned on. And I was like, I'll figure it out. And I did. And then there was a community called the Litas. So it's a global collective. There's branches all over the world. And they basically just organize meetups. It's not a club. It's just honestly for women to connect in the community and hang out and ride bikes. And I met some of my closest friends to this day. Last year, we went to Belize. We were the largest female riding group in Belize to go there.
But wait, did you bring your bikes to Belize?
No, so there actually was a woman that's part of the Litas in Belize that started a motorcycle rental company. So we rented all her bikes and then we basically bought out her bike too so that she could take us. Bunch of us had never ridden off-road. We went all through like mountains, everything was incredible. It's changed my entire life because truthfully, when you think of a biker, it's like this old adage of leather braids and tough, this, that, and the other.
Hell's Angels.
Right? I'm like, my helmet is sparkle. Every helmet I own sparkles. Yet I could be surrounded by somebody that's like a pure tattooed head to toe goth kind of thing. And it's all about showing up as exactly who you are. You ride with armor, but the minute you're parked, armor comes off and I'm like, I see you. I see you. They have been some of the most mature relationships I've had in my life. They challenged me. They were the ones that were like, we see you're not fulfilled. What is that? Let's dig. How about we view it another way? Can you make a leap? If you leap and you fail, we'll catch you. That's what motorcycling is to me. It has honestly changed my entire life.
And how often do you ride?
I mean, as much as the sun shines. Yeah, honestly.
Which is like you have a gap of 4 months.
I keep my bike insured year round just in case. So I'll normally go. I am a fair weather rider. I don't love getting drenched. And they're like, I have one girl that I ride with. She's what's known as an iron butt. So her and a friend of mine actually rode from Vancouver to Baja Peninsula in like 2 days last year. They just went straight out there. That's not my type of riding. I like some breaks.
And so professionally, how do you spend your time? You record the podcast. It's a weekly podcast. What else do you do?
So I'm all of that. So it's obviously producing the podcast, editing the podcast, getting everything uploaded. I run a blog on the site as well. So I try to do at least 3 to 5 articles a day.
For the same company?
For the same company. I also built the back end of that site so that it's putting everything into there. I'm basically a one-person band on that side professionally. So that's where it eats up my weekly hours. And then, yeah, spare time. It's like riding season now.
Good. What is your next dream or what are your next goals?
Truthfully, I've been writing a ton. So it's funny that you made a joke about a book. I've been a journaler forever. And I know so many people say, I've got a book in me. But when I talk about this moto community and the life lessons that I've had and how it sparked these different career leaps and different elements, I'm like, there's something here. And so it will happen. It's happening. I'm not one that normally says I'm going to do something and I don't do it. If I say I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it.
And what are you not going to do anymore at this stage of your life?
I'm not going to accept people that make me question any element of my self-confidence. I think sometimes I've experienced in corporate structure people that were my superiors that didn't really have big goals for themselves anymore, which is okay. Some people reach a point and they're like, I'm comfortable here. I'm good. I've never felt that in me, but I feel like if you work around people like that, you can almost adopt that mindset or feel like there's a ceiling. And I don't really believe in ceilings. I've reached so many different pinnacles that were once the dream. And then you get there, and I do think it's important to relish in it when you're there, but I think it's also important to know when to ask what's next. So I think I'm in a situation now that I have these incredible mentors that ceiling vibe isn't going to creep into my life. But if it did, I would recognize it a lot faster.
And now that you mentioned mentors, do you mentor anybody?
No.
No? So here, just a sneak peek of what a mentorship would look like with you. What pieces of advice would you give to someone who is younger and eager, like your younger self, you in your 20s, whatever field they might be venturing into? It doesn't have to be in communications, broadcasting, or podcasting, but people have big dreams in their early 20s, mid-20s. And like you said, it's not easy. There's limited spots for dreams, and so many people are competing for them. What would you like to say?
I know this is one that's said so much, but going back to what I hear so often from these C-suite execs that obviously have done very well, they've all remained really passionate to what they do. And that's something that I believe in very much as well. You have to have passion for what you do because it's not going to be easy. But don't confuse that passionate feeling for not needing to work exceptionally hard, especially in the beginning. I think sometimes we're so disillusioned in the era of social media that success happens like that. Maybe for some people, and how tremendous if it does. But at the end of the day, if you do have a dream, know You're going to get rejection. You're going to hear no's. It's probably not going to happen how you thought it was going to happen in the first place. You need to keep going. And yes, you can feel down in those moments where maybe it doesn't pan out in the right way, but you don't get to stay there. At the end of the day, nobody's going to come banging down your door, no matter what you're splashing out or how to get yourself out there. Nobody is going to bang down the door to kind of grab you and get you and give you the dream. You do actually have to work for it. And you also, even when you've got it, you have to keep evolving. So that would be my biggest advice too. Never stop learning, ever. I know my mentor now always says, leaders are readers. And I do genuinely believe that, because at the end, and don't just learn from people older than you, especially now. I'm constantly learning from people younger than me. They've grown up in technology in a completely different way that I have. So I think as well, check an ego at the door. When I quit my job in TV, I had to squash my ego. I jumped out of a thing with viewership to something that didn't exist. It's so important to not be married to your ego at any point. You have to kind of check yourself along the way.
Great. There you go. So these were a few pieces of advice. If you want to if you want to pursue your goals and get to your dreams, you're going to have to fight for them, right? I love it. Thank you so much. How can people get in touch with you, and where can they find your podcast?
So you can head to @All Things Fitness and Wellness, ATFW for short, and you can find me personally at Vann, 2 N's in Van City.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching or listening to another episode of the Canadian Dream Podcast. If you liked this chat with Krissy here, please remember to like it, to share this video with anybody that you also think would get some value from it. And remember to subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.